IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. This is one of those episodes where Anirudh and I latch on to a subject that we find deeply interesting and discuss it. Today, we want to talk about ancient Egypt. Why ancient Egypt? Well, for one thing, it has this reputation for being this really enduring civilization. So one of the things we'd like to explore is why was it enduring and what does it tell us today? The other is, while Egyptian civilization was enduring, there's a lot more to it. It wasn't just a static series of dynasties, with an unchanging society and unchanging polity. In fact, Egypt kept changing. To understand how vast and varied this civilization is, just think about Cleopatra. Cleopatra is closer to our time than to the time of the pyramids that existed in her kingdom. That's really how ancient civilization is in Egypt. So Anirudh, I want to start by asking you a very basic question. Why did a civilization begin in Egypt?
So the question of why civilizations originated is a really complicated, really contested one. But let me present one of my favorite ideas on the origin of civilization. This comes from a chap called James Scott. I know that you and he, Aditya, have your disagreements. But I think that when it comes to the origin of civilization, he does have some fairly interesting ideas. Now, very often, the way that we think about civilization is that it's all about the river valleys, right? And broadly, it does seem that all of the most famous civilizations started up near river valleys. You have the Indus civilization, you have the Mesopotamian civilization, and of course, you have the Egyptian civilization. And the argument that is generally presented is that people living around river valleys had consistent access to crops. As a result, they would grow more and more crops, and this surplus in crops is what enabled them to have a growing population and then gradually start to have cities and found empires and so on. But the real history of agriculture is really far, far more complex than that. One really great example is how agriculture spread in Europe, which is a long, long way from Egypt. In Europe, for example, one major group of people in the late Neolithic period began to migrate out of Anatolia into Greece and thence into the Balkans. And the way that these people spread, they're called the Longhouse culture. You can look them up. The way that these people spread is that they would have family units who would go and settle in one particular area of a river valley. The eldest son of the family unit would retain the ancestral land, whereas the younger sons would basically move further upriver and set up their own farmsteads there. And that's how they would kind of spread across generations. So clearly what you're seeing here is a migratory agrarian civilization. It's not necessarily forming an urban culture, but it's very clearly a culture characterized, as I said, by longhouses. So there's a very particular set of factors that go into transitioning from an agrarian civilization, from an agrarian culture to an agrarian civilization, with cities, with armies, and that kind of thing. And according to James C. Scott, in his excellent book Against the Grain, the reason why this happens is because you have an area where it isn't feasible to be purely agrarian, or to put it more elegantly, agrarian civilization, agrarian cultures can only survive if they are seizing resources from other agrarian cultures. So what happens is that in these areas of scarcity coupled with plenty, where in one season you might have a lot of food, in another season you might not have a lot of food, you slowly start to develop organized structures of authority. You slowly start to develop some form of political differentiation. You start to elect leaders. These leaders' job is to go to war against neighboring villages, for example, and kind of secure their agrarian surplus for the benefit of their people, their town. And what you see over centuries gradually is that these political elites, these political and military elites, gradually become wealthier and more powerful than the people that they rule over. They start to set up systems of taxation. They start to build walls so they can enclose their people, but also keep enemy peoples out. And over many centuries, these gradually lead to more complicated systems of administration, more presence for military culture. You start to see the emergence of religion because you have like many diverse people who need to be integrated into a kind of a single state mechanism. You see the origins of patriarchy because you need to have a large force of young men who are willing to fight, which means that women need to be basically kept at home in order to be mothers and to give birth to new generations of young men. This broadly is the way that Egypt also originates, in my view. What you have is this vast desert in the middle of which you have a very thin Nile River valley with only like a few dozen square kilometers on each side, which are suitable for agricultural cultivation. And through conflict with the desert peoples, you see the emergence of power structures, and you see the emergence of political and urban elites in two areas called Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Now, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt are kind of counterintuitive. Upper Egypt is actually the southern part of Egypt, and Lower Egypt is the northern part of Egypt. This is because the Egyptian worldview was kind of flipped on its head in our eyes, because to them, north was south and south was north, in a sense. So Upper Egypt was a relatively drier area, whereas Lower Egypt, including the Nile River Delta, was far marshier. Over the course of the early Bronze Age, you see the kings of Upper Egypt gradually going to war over Lower Egypt as well, and eventually declaring themselves to be the lords of both Upper and Lower Egypt. One of the most famous indications we have of this new kind of political unity is from something called the Narmer Palette. This was discovered in Upper Egypt, and it shows an Egyptian king wearing the crown of Upper Egypt, basically smiting his enemies, and surrounded by imagery that's redolent both of nature but also for very new kind of political culture, which seeks to depict a king as almost a god. And I think one of the reasons why Egypt is so enduring, one of the reasons why Egypt lasted all the way from the Bronze Age, from the 4th millennium BC, all the way up to the time of Cleopatra, which is roughly the turn of the 1st millennium CE, is that from very early on, these Egyptian kings have a very masterful system of propaganda. Now, this is something that you see with a lot of Bronze Age cultures. Keep in mind that to the Bronze Age cultures, there had never been civilizations to look back to. There had never been like these great, grand imperial religions to look back to. Everything that happens in the Bronze Age was happening for the first time in human history. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had just been hunter-gatherers, or they had been cultivating in very limited ways. They didn't have very hierarchical societies. But all of a sudden, from roughly the 4th millennium BC onwards, in the Indus Valley, in the Mesopotamian, in the Mesopotamia River Valley, and in the Nile River Valley, you see the sudden emergence of states which had never really existed before. All of these states are innovating in some truly amazing and truly remarkable ways. One great example is writing, of course. Writing originated because all these states needed a way to keep track of who was paying taxes to them and who wasn't. You start to see the origins of a new kind of political elite who have to justify the fact that they are so much wealthier, so much more powerful than the vast majority of people that they rule over. And you see them living in much better conditions than the vast majority of people. And you see, therefore, the origins of religion, of royal propaganda, in order to justify this kind of inequality. Now, the way the Egyptians do it is really, really amazing, and it's very tied to the natural circumstances within which they find themselves. As I'm sure you know, the Nile River is a very finicky kind of river. In one season during the year, the Nile overflows its banks. It inundates a large swathe of land through the river valley. In another season, these waters gradually kind of recede, leaving behind fertile alluvial lands, which are really great for agricultural cultivation. So there's this very real sense, if you're an ancient Egyptian person, if you're just a farmer and all you can do is just, cultivate your crops and hope that your king doesn't take too much crops away from you. You have a very real sense of the rhythms and the cycles of nature. And you're very dependent on the Nile River to do its job and to just have a nice, steady kind of flood that you can use to kind of cultivate later. A very low flood will mean that you won't have enough agricultural land to cultivate, which means you won't be able to pay your taxes, which means you're going to be screwed by tax collectors. An extremely high flood will mean that your village and your house will probably be destroyed, and you will and it'll be really difficult for you to bounce back from that and have a good harvest. Now, what the Egyptian pharaohs do is they identify this rhythm of nature. They identify this thing that all their subjects are going to see, and they use that as the bedrock of their royal propaganda by saying that it is the king, it is the pharaoh who is responsible for ensuring that the Nile floods properly. So you see all kinds of really weird rituals. At one point, for example, you see an Egyptian imperial culture, this ritual where the pharaoh basically masturbates into the waters of the Nile because his semen is believed to have fertile powers. But basically, what the essence of what is happening here is that the king is saying that, look, I am the one who maintains order. I am the one who makes sure that within the primordial chaos of this world, this rhythm of the Nile is maintained, and therefore I am more than just a king. I am more than just a person who has a large army at my command and therefore is able to extract taxes from you. I am a god, and I am a god who is integral to the very nature, the very world that you people see around you. And it's a remarkably effective kind of political tool. You see this identification of this despotic ruler with the very concept of order itself. From the very genesis of Egyptian civilization in the 4th millennium, all the way to much, much later during the time of Cleopatra. And in fact, this underlying order that people must give totalitarian powers to a despotic figure and just trust him to do what is best, and to question him being tantamount to siding with the forces of chaos against the forces of order is something that exists even today in the 21st century in democratic and republican systems. This populist takeover from the right wing that we see in many countries today is based on something very similar. This idea that an authoritarian strongman who cannot be questioned is going to restore order, and that anybody who questions him is a representative of chaos, is something that you see in the very, very beginning of civilization itself during the Egyptian period.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most enduring ideas about authority of any kind. It strikes me that, at the risk of sounding like a geographical determinist, I think it matters that the Nile River Valley is really sitting in the middle of a desert. And so for the agriculturalists there, the river is everything. It's not like the river augments rainfall. It's not like setting up a civilization in the Indo-Gangetic plains where you have the monsoons and snow-fed rivers. The river is all you have. And so, it's kind of, it seems to me kind of understandable that the river and rituals around it are so important, and that authority is itself constructed around that. Now, this authority that the Egyptian rulers, the pharaohs, seem to have had, Anirudh, is also cited as the reason for Egypt being so enduring, and also implicitly for being an unchanging culture. But, I'm no expert at all, but when I go and read books about the ancient Egyptians, I see a lot of political chaos at the top. So how do you reconcile these two ideas?
So I think it really depends on what you're looking at as the enduring elements of Egyptian civilization. On the one hand, this idea of the pharaoh as a god king who maintains order against the forces of chaos is something that shows up again and again across dynasties. But if you actually look at the substance of power itself, how these dynasties actually maintain authority, it really, really varies, and there's an enormous amount of diversity that happens. So let's look at the Old Kingdom, for example. The first really major Egyptian empire. The Old Kingdom are the guys who are responsible for the pyramids at Giza. Now, during that period, you had a very, very despotic and family-centered kind of royal authority. where all major administrative and political functions were held by members of the pharaoh's family. And it's an extremely centralized, extremely despotic, extremely totalitarian system. But it's also because of that kind of absolute state control that you're able to see these gigantic monuments like the pyramids of Egypt, which are by far one of the most stupendous monuments made by any human culture at any point of time. The pyramids also offer us a bit of an insight into the sheer kind of administrative capacity of this Bronze Age civilization. Keep in mind, we're talking about a civilization that is thousands upon thousands of years old, and you still see stuff within it that seems really strikingly modern. If you look at Old Kingdom art, for example, if you look at their sculptures, you see this very, very elegant and stylized representation of the human body that we see in, for example, medieval India. And it's really striking to see just how sophisticated that aesthetic culture was. And it also shows you that as far as those people were concerned, they were in no ways ancient. We call them ancient Egyptians, but to themselves, they must have been the most technologically sophisticated and modern people of their times. If you look at some of the papyri that have survived to this day about the construction of the pyramids themselves, once again, it's very remarkable. You see very, very, very detailed logistical manifestos. One really famous one is a ship captain's manifesto, which tells him at precisely what time he and his crew are expected to wake up, which port they're supposed to report to, which cafeteria they can receive their food from, which inspector is going to be looking at their cargo at that same time, where they're supposed to go after that, where they're supposed to pick up their next cargo. And it really tells you how ancient this concept of organization, the need for organizational sophistication in order to conduct these big monumental building projects are. Monumental building projects are, of course, another very important aspect of ancient Egyptian culture. But of course, what those monuments precisely are can vary very, very drastically over time. So the pyramids were, which glorify a particular dynasty of kings, these massive monumental structures, are the monumental architecture that the Old Kingdom kind of sticks onto. Whereas by the Middle Kingdom, you see that there's a great deal of change, and you suddenly see a new and more diverse kind of ruling elite. And instead of seeing pyramids, you start to see the emergence of tombs. And these tombs are not built merely by the royal family, but also by bureaucrats, administrators, ministers, scribes, a professional class of people who have kind of emerged in order to work with the ruling dynasty to rule over all these people. And you also see the Egyptian, the emergence of new gods to prominence at different points of time. So during the Old Kingdom period, it's really the sun that is the most prominent god, right? Ra. If you look at a pyramid is fundamentally meant to represent sunlight. If you were to let sunlight into a room from a single point, you see it forming a pyramid. That is exactly what a pyramid is supposed to do. It's supposed to represent sunlight emerging from the tip of the pyramid all the way down to the base. And if you look at papyri from the period, they describe the pyramids as the horizon of Khufu, and that kind of really grandiose thing. So as far as these pharaohs were concerned, they were building an artificial horizon for the sun to rise and set beyond, which is absolutely crazy if you think about just how proud and arrogant these rulers were. But as I said, so by the Middle Kingdom, things are changing. You see the emergence of a new god, namely Osiris, the god of the dead. And you see, again, a very, very sophisticated kind of religious culture to support Osiris. You see the emergence of new pilgrimage sites to Osiris, and you see these new monumental temples to Osiris. And you see religious processions becoming a very, very big part of Egyptian culture at that time. And then, of course, you have the New Kingdom, by which time Egypt has kind of started to emerge onto the global sphere and is really interacting with a lot of other new cultures that are emerging across the Bronze Age world. The same kind of civilizing process where I talked about urbanism and this new kind of political class and royal propaganda has developed over many parts of the world over these centuries. And you see the emergence of these very powerful ruling elites, all of whom rely extensively on trading with international partners to maintain their wealth, to fund armies and therefore to maintain their control over the rest of the world. So once again, to summarize, there are some elements of continuity. There is a certain monumentality in architecture. There is a certain kind of continuity in terms of royal propaganda. But the substance of power changes in very, very significant and very important ways. The number of people, the backgrounds of the people who are participating in the act of ruling changes. The culture that is used, the religious culture, the material culture that is used to differentiate them from the vast majority of people who are toiling and breaking their backs in the fields changes. So you have elements of enduringness, but you also have a lot of very exciting elements of change over many, many millennia.
Yeah, and it does very much sound like a really dynamic society. And I do remember reading about evidence found of, for example, court trials of somebody. So there's for example, of court trials of somebody who was committing adultery. There's a lively culture. There are different institutions. People are cracking jokes. This is a living, breathing world. And like you said, those people didn't think of themselves as ancient, and in fact, they would have thought of themselves as quite contemporary. And when they look back at pyramids built 1,000 or 2,000 years back, they must have considered that ancient. So yeah,
here's another really interesting example. As you mentioned, court proceedings, right? I think it was the pharaoh Ramesses III, who was assassinated quite brutally. He was kind of hacked to pieces with an axe. And the person responsible for his murder was one of his sons, who kind of led a conspiracy with many of the women of the harem to kind of murder his own father so he could seize the throne. Now, his elder brother, who was the designated heir, managed to consolidate power, of course. But because, as I mentioned earlier, the pharaoh is so publicly identified with the concept of order, he's also fundamentally identified with the concept of justice. So in court records from the trial of his half-brother who murdered his father, this pharaoh very clearly says that I will absolutely follow the law. I am merely a servant of justice. I will do whatever the court recommends that I do, and let it be known that here I am merely performing my duty as the agent of order in this. And the proceedings of the court are like fairly elaborate, fairly well documented. There's a lot of evidence that's presented about each of the people who are involved in the conspiracy. Of course, to the Egyptians, torture was fairly normal in extracting confessions. So we have evidence of like how these people were tortured, what kind of confessions they made in court. And finally, the kind of punishments that they were given. And again, the kind of punishments give us a fascinating insight into the way that religion and political culture all kind of melded together into their daily lives. A lot of the conspirators were ordered to be burned at the stake immediately, and their ashes were scattered along the roads of Egypt. This was basically meant to ensure that their bodies could not be mummified and preserved, which meant that they simply could not enter heaven. They could not enter the afterlife, which was an absolutely horrifying kind of punishment. And here's the most interesting thing. The prince who had murdered his father was actually discovered in his father's tomb, sewn up in the skin of a goat, evidently cursed to be his father's servant for all eternity. And his mummy shows marks of torture and show that he died a supremely unpleasant death. So while you see a lot of very modern things in the way that these Egyptians function, you also see things that seem totally alien and totally unrecognizable to us. Of course, if you brought an ancient Egyptian to our world, they would have said something very similar about our culture and the way that our religious ideas, like, for example, democracy and human rights, contrast with theirs. But it kind of shows you just how also arbitrary a lot of these values that we take for granted really are. Human rights has a history of barely a couple of hundred years, whereas the Egyptian royal culture, the Egyptian culture of the afterlife, the Egyptian culture of pharaohs and human god kings as the absolute arbiters of justice and order, arguably has a far more ancient pedigree behind it.
Yeah, it says something about how distant these people are from us, that they seem both savage and sophisticated, so relatable and yet also so strange. Now, of course, the Egypt we're talking about so far, Anirudh, is Bronze Age Egypt, right? But around the 12th century BC, something like 3,200 years back, something fundamentally changes, and not just in Egypt, across Bronze Age civilizations. And Egyptian civilization is actually one of those that managed to kind of endure, albeit in a weakened form. How does Egypt experience this collapse and deal with it? What do we know about that?
So I think we need to have a little more context on what this world of the Bronze Age looked like. Now, we are very used to thinking of internationalism, globalization, international trade as being very modern things. They are modern, but only in scale, because the world of the Bronze Age had concepts of international trade, international diplomacy, and some form of globalization, though, of course, it took a form very different from what we might recognize today. So let's just do a quick survey, broadly going north to south and west to east. So at the furthest west of the settled Bronze Age cultures was, of course, Greece. Greece was dominated by a culture called the Mycenaean culture. These guys had citadels, this very interesting kind of warrior culture. A little off to their south, on the island of Crete, were a culture that is called the Minoans, though we have no idea what these guys actually called themselves. The Minoans were far more peaceful, just generally traders. Very, very interesting culture with these massive palace complexes, and almost no evidence of like militarism and wars have really been found from the Minoan period in Crete. Moving a little further north and to the east, we see the civilization of the Hittites. This is mostly based in Anatolia, modern Turkey. There's a lot of city-states along the coast which have a plethora of varied relationships to Hattusa, which is the great imperial center of the Hittites, which is in the central part of Anatolia. One of these cities along the coast, incidentally, is Troy, which would later be destroyed by the Greeks and the Mycenaeans in the events surrounding the Bronze Age collapse, and would later be immortalized in the Iliad, the famous Greek work of literature. Moving further to the east and to the south, in modern-day Syria, we see the culture of the Mitanni. The Mitanni are really fascinating people. They seem to, at least the elites seem to have spoken some sort of Indo-Aryan language. We see a lot of them having Indo-Aryan names, and we see Indo-Aryan names mentioned in manuals of horse training and chariot training. How exactly those Indo-Aryans managed to end up there is really up for debate. If you go further off to the east, you will see the great riverine and agricultural civilizations of Mesopotamia, many city-states which at some points formed empires. And once again, moving back to the west, you see the many city-states of the Levant, Palestine, which at various points were under the influence of Mesopotamia or of Egypt. And then finally, moving south once again, we see Egypt itself. Now, all of the ruling dynasties of these cultures had very, very deep trade and artistic and familial interrelationships. We see these kings offering their daughters in marriage to each other, their daughters and their sisters. We see them exchanging embassies. And here's another really fascinating bit about the culture of the Bronze Age. Not everybody was literate then. Definitely very, very small percentage of population compared to now. And much of these interactions between kings were actually conducted by scribes. So the kings themselves were in many cases not literate. They would dictate messages to other kings to their scribes. Their scribes would write it down, send it to the other kingdom, and that king's scribe would read it to the king. So you will see in these diplomatic missives, say to such and such king this. So they're meant as instructions to one scribe from another. And sometimes you see these scribes also kind of scribbling in little notes in the margins, something on the lines of, "Hey man, it's been a while. I hope you and your family are good." This is because only the scribes would be able to read that, and the kings would have no idea that these scribes were conducting this secret correspondence on the side. Just an interesting nugget of Bronze Age history, which I just find so human and so relatable. Now, in Egypt at that time, you see some really remarkable stuff. You see art forms from Crete starting to emerge in Egyptian palaces at that time. Now, again, just think how remarkable it is. It would be something like, just like how modern Indian elites tend to build their houses along Western architectural principles, you see something very similar happening with the Egyptians of like the 15th, 14th century in the Bronze Age. And you also see trade artifacts. You see stuff like wine. You see stuff like tin, which was crucial to making bronze, which was like which was one of the most important strategic resources of the time. You see gold. You see crafts. You see expensive ointments, cloths, all kinds of stuff being exchanged by all these powerful elites. The purpose of all this international trade was to keep the elites much richer than the vast majority of the people, and basically give them allies in other areas, give them clients in other areas who could be mobilized to bring military forces to kind of maintain control over various areas. So you see a very dynamic and very fascinating kind of elite culture, this multinational globalized culture of the Bronze Age emerging around this time. But some really, really weird stuff starts to go down roughly in the 12th century. Now, there's a lot of debate as to like precisely what started off this crazy series of events. But one of those things appears to have been a series of super earthquakes that hit Anatolia at that time, which led to the collapse of many great Hittite cities and seems to have displaced large populations and led to famine. Now, what this basically led to is that you have a massive shock being inflicted upon the political system of the Hittites. They are no longer able to extract the kind of agrarian revenue that is required to maintain military control over all these regions. So all of a sudden you have people who no longer have access to any form of justice, who no longer have access to any kind of administrative structure, and who suddenly find themselves let loose. And what they do, as you can imagine, is try to bring their families together and go out and try to secure themselves some food, try to secure themselves some shelter. And gradually you see these massive bands of refugees who are just going and like overriding what few centers of order remain. You see cities being burnt to the ground and the sudden collapse almost overnight of the Hittite Empire. And as a result of the collapse of the Hittites, who, as we recall, were important trading partners to all these other Bronze Age civilizations, you see the entire international system slowly starting to shake at its foundations, because the elites no longer have the wealth they need in order to maintain large standing armies and fight other civilizations off. And so you suddenly see the collapse of political order. You see the movements of these massive numbers of like refugees who are just devouring cities as they go, who are now completely free of any sort of royal authority and are therefore striking out on their own. And into all this crazy mix enter a bunch of people from somewhere to the west, probably from Sicily, Sardinia, from islands in the Mediterranean Sea, who are called the Sea Peoples. And these guys are just out there to raid, to loot, and also to kind of find some kind of settled authority. But not a lot of civilizations, as you can imagine, are able to cope with this wave of humanity. So very, very soon, you see the collapse of the Mitanni, you see the collapse of order in Mesopotamia, you see the collapse of many Mycenaean centers of authority, you see the collapse of Crete. And very soon after, you start to see references to Greeks and Mycenaeans suddenly appearing in the Levant. So clearly you seem to have a very mobile group of refugees, some of whom are very militarily capable, some of whom are land-based, some of whom are sea-based, who are just taking their authority who are just taking their chances everywhere they can, and who pose a massive challenge to the settled agrarian political elites of the Bronze Age.
Yeah, the Sea Peoples were most likely not just raiders but also refugees. What exactly they were fleeing, natural calamity, man-made calamity, a combination of both, is something we have absolutely no idea about. But like Anirudh, you pointed out that these people may have come, for example, from Sardinia and Sicily. One of the reasons we think that is because of some of the name places mentioned in Egyptian sources. Shardana is probably Sardinia. Sekalesh is probably Sicily. Now, of course, we don't know also if these people came from there or they went there, because one of the other names there is Peleset. And Peleset is the origins of the word Philistine, which is our modern Palestine or Palestinian. And we do have evidence of people who are in some way descended from Mycenaean Greek culture, residing in what is today Palestine in Israel. And in fact, the whole story of David and Goliath, of Jaliyat and David, the story of a conflict in the early Iron Age between some sort of Philistine and an Israelite. So it's really fascinating. And we have these tantalizing glimpses, Anirudh, but we really have absolutely no idea why these sea people surged out. But do we have a better idea about why exactly the collapse happened? Was it just a combination of, these supply chains being disrupted, royal authority being undermined, or was there something else? So did natural disasters play a part in this?
Like I said, Aditya, definitely earthquakes seem to have been one part of it in one part of the entire collapse. But I'm also assuming that there's a lot of other stuff that's happening. You have rivers that are gradually changing courses over centuries. You have the gradual change of climate because of extensive urbanization and deforestation over many centuries. All of which are, once again, this is the first major world civilization we're seeing, right? All of these are very novel challenges that have never really been faced by any of these cultures before. And given that even today, with the kind of technological capabilities we have, we find a lot of these a challenge. You can see why it might not have been realistic for a lot of these people to really fight back. The Indus civilization, for example, seems to have collapsed for something like this, right? There seems to have been a change in the course of the Indus River. There seems to have been climate change due to deforestation. You see salinization of a lot of the agrarian areas because of many, many centuries of crop growth. And as a result, you see urban centers growing smaller, people leaving, people migrating to kind of like start up their own lives elsewhere, and eventually, of course, interacting with the Indo-Aryans and Indo-Europeans who were coming in from the steppe at the time. But let's bring our focus back to Egypt, right? I think the real question is, how is it that when the Hittites collapsed, when many Mesopotamian cities collapsed, when the Mycenaeans collapsed, when the Cretans, the Minoans collapsed, how was it that the Egyptians managed to survive? And I think, once again, the answer really lies in the fact that you have deserts that surround the Nile Valley. So it is simply not practicable for large numbers of people to invade Egypt from multiple directions. So the pharaoh Thutmose III actually did face many invasions of the sea peoples, but these came into the Nile River Delta directly, and he was able to beat them off through some pretty desperate warfare from what we can tell. There are these spectacular murals which show the Battle of the Nile River Delta. It seems to have been an amphibious sort of operation with many sea peoples coming in ships, many of them trying to advance over land. You see this enormous diversity in the kind of costumes that these sea peoples are wearing. You see some with plumed helmets, some with horned helmets, some with very elaborate kind of armor, some who are barely wearing loincloths. And it kind of shows you that you see a massive upheaval in all of the peoples of the civilized world at that time. And Egypt managed to survive because it had such an effective kind of authoritarian system. It had such an effective way of mobilizing agrarian surplus and mobilizing its population for a singular kind of purpose, right? And as a result, they're able to fight off the sea peoples, but more importantly, they're also able to buy them off. One of the big elements of Thutmose's policy and his mention of these sea peoples is that he talks about how he has settled them in the Nile River Valley as kind of subjects of his. This is, of course, something that the Romans would do many, many centuries later when they faced their own issues with migratory hordes, specifically the Goths. And once again, it kind of tells us something about the enduring nature of power and the enduring kind of challenges that civilizations and civilized states face. And I think it also brings up some very interesting questions about what might happen as our own existing global system, which is far, far exponentially larger, exponentially more complex than that of the Bronze Age. What happens when we start to see shocks because of climate change? What happens if, for example, a large swathe of North India no longer has access to perennial water, or is kind of displaced because of massive flooding and begins to migrate in search of like other places to stay? What kind of refugee movements might we see as the islands of the Indian Ocean are submerged and as peoples begin to flee to India and to other countries along the Indian Ocean rim in seeking new places to stay? What kind of challenges might it pose for political leaders? How might political leaders respond? What kind of new forms of power might we see? It really brings up a lot of really interesting questions, and kind of goes to show that in a lot of ways the Bronze Age is a very different world. It is a very strange world, but in a lot of ways it is also the same world that we inhabit, with many of the same kind of challenges that we face even today.
Yes, I continue to be struck, Anirudh, by both how unfamiliar and familiar this world is. And obviously, our civilization is not the first to grapple with issues of climate change, environmental degradation, mass refugee crises, political upheavals, plagues, and pandemics. And we're going to continue to deal with these things. And maybe we can just take a little heart and maybe the odd warning from the Bronze Age. I think both Anirudh and I would certainly like to recommend one book each that interested listeners can pursue. I would recommend 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed by Eric Klein. Anirudh, what would you recommend on ancient Egypt?
I would recommend The Rise and Fall of Ancient Egypt by Toby Wilkinson. And also for like a more general introduction to the origins of civilization, I would say James C. Scott's Against the Grain is a really fascinating and thought-provoking read.
Well, if we're doing two books each, I'd also mention Richard Miles' The Ancient Worlds. Anyway, we'll leave it at that. That's a lot of reading for our listeners to do. Thank you so much, Anirudh, and looking forward to having more such discussions with you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. It's been a really, really great week on the network. Let me make a couple of recommendations to you guys. Agla Station Adulthood, they have an extraordinary episode on relationships. Ritasha and Ayushi, as always, do a bang-up job. I think you'll really enjoy that conversation. Check out Edges and Sledges, where DJ Ashwin and Varun have been talking to fans from different IPL teams on every episode. It's a really, really interesting project they've taken on during the course of the IPL. And as it comes to a conclusion, I'm sure you'll love to hear the thoughts on the tournament as a whole. I want to mention Uncle Please Sit. They had a really great episode which dove into why is pollution so bad. And I think that given the circumstances we're dealing with right now, it makes a ton of sense to listen to that. Cyrus had a really great week on his show as well. On the Monday episode, he spoke to Raj and DK about all kinds of stuff. He was in one of their early movies. Definitely a fun conversation to check that out. And finally, let me talk to you about the Wire Talks with Siddharth Bhatia. We're very excited about this show. On the first episode, Jairam Ramesh is there having conversation with Siddharth Bhatia about the legacy of Indira Gandhi. I think you will really, really get something out of this. Do give it a listen. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Whether you're an established sports person or a budding one, or simply a sports enthusiast, join us, Tanvi and Shlok.
We are two passionate pro badminton players talking policy, mindset, and everything sport.
So tune in to The Millennial Athlete every Monday.
Only on the IVM Podcast Network.
Trust us, it's gonna be lit.